Wow, that's a horrible color. Okay, I think it's warming up. Does it always do this? Awesome. Turn it on at once. It just wouldn't be a full day without a hardware failure. So the way you set up these, and this is our last config file of the day. I know you're excited about these. The config file for this stuff, like many of these others, here's a word of caution before I close this one. Who remembers what createCompletion.config configures? Does anyone remember? It's quiz. It's end of the day quiz. Create completion, this configuration file. There are 3 of them. I'll give you a clue. There's 3. There's create completion config, create wellbore config, and create well config. Well level manager. These are for well level manager. Whenever you make a change to basic data in one of them, you want to remember to make it in all 3. Right now there is actually a really weird bug that we're fixing in 2017.1, where if you change something in one of them and not in the others, it sends that whole group down to the bottom of the page in Well Level Manager. I don't think anyone's ever not kept them in sync before, so we had no idea it was going to happen until I did it. I thought it went away completely, but it was at the bottom of the page. So just keep in mind that you want to make, when you make a change to one, you make it to all 3. So the way that you change the reference data stuff, I mentioned there's a few things that are different about it. One of the things that Mike Hayden and his team have started doing recently is doing extensive inline documentation. And this is probably early on when they were pretty ambitious about it. They were taking me seriously, and they wrote like a novel in the top end of it, which is really awesome, because when you're in here, you're like, I forgot where I put the book or the booklet or the email you sent. So like, what do? The reference data manager defines all of the stuff that you're going to see in here on this side. What tables are available, and when that table comes up, what is it going to look like? So when you have, for example, the area table displayed, it's going to define things from that table in a particular manner. It is also going to protect your database by maintaining the foreign key relationships that are important. And this is something, as you are going through and perhaps having new source systems bring in data to support new views, to support new workflows, you may find that one of your new sources has a bunch of values that need a reference table. You have, what's a good example? If you have something brand new like, operator type. Suppose you bring in suppose you're looking at an operator history over time, and you have, was the operator an owner or more than a certain percent ownership owner of the well, in case that's something you wanted to evaluate. And you ended up saying, you know what, I really need a reference table to define the 5 possible values that people can put in for that. Full owner, partial owner, more than 50% owner, whatever I wanted to put in there. If you had a reference table that you needed added, you would create an entry in here. What I do is I copy one that I like that looks pretty good, and I just change the values I need to change for this. So you would copy one that looks kind of similar to the new reference table you wanted to add, but you have to be careful to look at the database and see what foreign keys you have to enforce for that. Keeping in mind that when people use the reference data manager, when they use this, they are going to edit rows. And when they edit rows, they could choose or type in nonsensical values. And you want to make sure those potential nonsensical values are things that don't break your database. So you want to make sure that when you are putting a reference table out there for editing and saying, go add your values in there, that you have things that make sense here. And a fairly easy example on that is the area type preferences, where when you define your area type preferences, you want to say the only ones I can enter, the only area types I want to be able to enter here are area types that exist in our area type. So I want to only be able to pick from things that make sense. I don't want any free text entry. That could be bad because it doesn't enforce the need that I would then also want an entry inserted into our area type. Unless you want to create some kind of a trigger that does that, it's much easier to use something like a foreign key relationship. And the other thing to remember is when you want to group these, of course, you can put a category name over this. Just like in quick search config and query config, there's a structure to this. And what Mike or Nick or someone on his team has so kindly done is they have put up here what that is. So you can always reference this to see what categories and then what tables within there and columns and foreign keys need to exist for that, as well as some of the possibilities that you can have for this. Is it read-only? Is it even visible? If this is populated within the table but no one ever needs to see it because it's way behind the scenes, please don't make it visible and don't let the user edit it. And then within the foreign keys, we also have show inactive data, which essentially looks to see if it's even an active record, do I want to display it or not. So keep in mind that when you put this stuff in, you've got config, category, category name, table, table area. You're editing within table, you're editing the columns within there, you're giving it foreign keys, and then where necessary, Brian asked specifically about VA alias earlier, so let's look at that. Okay, I spelled it wrong. Okay, in the alias tables, the aliases for field, so if I'm looking at field ID and field alias ID, note that they both need to be defined as fields. Okay, so whenever I have a field that I add or a field alias, they both need to be defined back to the field table. And the field aliases need to be, they both need to have valid field IDs that are both active in that table. Some of the RA tables that are listed here, RA well profile type, are not, I believe, not visible now in here because that is something that we've specified in the blending hierarchy as an alias. We've managed the entry into that table through the blending admin screen with the blending levels to say alias it or not, so we no longer now manage it here. So keep in mind when things are not here, it's because they are now managed in the other table. But other than that, a lot of this you're not going to necessarily use right away, and you're not necessarily going to understand it without using it. So if you want to, in a test environment, try anything in this book, almost everything we've gone through today is safe to do with the possible exception of messing with the blending preferences and the blending level hierarchy, because that takes some thought. But what you do want to give thought to is if you are mulling over something that you want to change or define, first come up with a way to identify the scenarios that might impact. Not only for testing purposes to make sure, okay, did it actually work or did it not work, but also to figure out how to grab the records that would be impacted if you change that blending level. So how to actually retrieve those and then set active indicator equal active indicator for all of those records. And keep in mind, you're going to set it for, if you set it for well version, it is not necessarily going to touch the well aux version records for that. Those are two different tables. We are looking at a way to make sure we bulletproof the triggers between those two. And actually, we have something I'm looking at this morning. I saw a message on it where we have to, Krista and I are kind of talking with our team to figure out, do we have it all covered? Like if you change a well aux version, do I also want to trigger well version to blend? If I touch well version, do I also want to trigger well aux version? What is the relationship, and is there necessarily a relationship in all of that? Just to make sure we have it straight.
Is there ever a reason to make something straight to the production environment without taking a test?
And
There is never.
No, and I can't tell you, I about had a heart attack every time I had to touch the Sanchez environment when you only had production. I think you have tests now, right? Yeah. You used to only have a production environment, and it was almost like, rock, paper, scissors to figure out who had to go do something, because it was terrifying to think, if I screw this up, that's your production environment. So that's a really horrifying scenario to be in.
How do I know? Because it's a handoff. We're after the handoff. Certain people how do I give that to them with the proper instruction to make sure that it gets where it needs to get.
I don't have those. I know someone on my team, probably in Calgary, has an implementation script that scrapes all of that. I think you guys have one too. You did specific to your own needs. But you're going to need to have an implementation script that scrapes not only the database, but like you're saying, all of the config files, and even possibly some of the data contents that you put in the reference data tables to make that make sense too. So, and not the least of which are any stored procedures that you customized. If you've customized stored procedures to do a special kind of matching, or if you have something different about your particular aggregation needs, and we have done that before, like for example, we used you as an example earlier, Troy, with your downward blending from well origin down, and I don't think it's really truly all the way always downward, but it generally starts with the origin and then we get the borehole and yeah. It's so you have some special stuff. We obviously can't just, take like you're saying, Brian, you can't always just take a copy of the database and throw it in and go, yeah, it's good, because that's not always true. And you need to do some things in a certain order as well. We have some scripts that can be written to take all the contents of all the tables, create insert scripts, and write them back out. Other tables are just so darn big, like business associate or area, whatever, that you may not want to do that. So we do have a set of implementation scripts that we've used with different clients. If you need to do that, please by all means reach out to us and we'll figure out how to help you do that, because we don't want you to get it wrong. Even environments where we've done extensive customization, it sometimes takes us like a week to make sure we've gotten everything together. We do partial moves up to go, would that work right? Nope, we forgot this table. Nope, we forgot that stored procedure. We forgot this. Oh, that's right, we customized that. I will say, keep track of everything you change. Whether it's by looking at making sure when you make a database change to a database row or value, you change the row change date, or make sure you track anything that's been changed in an environment from vanilla to the way you got it working the way you wanted it to. Because if you don't track that, you're not going to know the delta that you have to move up. You can start with a base install in that second environment, and then script out anything that's different and script that into the new environment. That would probably be the safest way to do it if mostly it's vanilla and only some of it is changed. But if you've changed a lot, you may have to scrape the whole database and scrape all the files. Knowing the config files that have changed, most of the config files you can just move up. You can probably generally take the config directory and replace it up, because that's where you're going to have most of the changes that you've made that make your environment look the way you want it to look. And for the most part, I think as long as you have the config files, all of them together, and keep in mind, you have a config directory under your TDM version, you have a config directory under your loader version, and you have a config directory under your scheduler service. Or rather, you have a config file under your scheduler service. So
version control, all binaries, all
awesome. That's smart. We probably should change that on our site too. Or at least have something that checks and make sure that that's all straight. And there's even other things in here within TDM, even outside of the config directory. We have some things that sit outside it, like a web config file, as well as we have middleware that sits out there. We've got middleware that sits out here under all of these. We did a change to we have some config files here that control how those two custom ref simple and custom ref composite aux fields actually can reference to reference files. That had to happen in the nhibernate part of TDM. If you remember when nhibernate came in, that was quite an effort. So we have config files that kind of sit throughout, so you want to look at the whole repository, and ideally there's got to be a server tool that'll tell you what files have changed since, vanilla install date, which would be a good way to scrape them. That's a good question. It's easy to forget simple things. Did you change your reports module? Did you add something to it that isn't in one but is in the other? So you're getting the delta is really important. That's a good question. Any other questions on things? It is 4 o'clock.
Day 3.
Day 3. I'm in trouble, Mike. I know I didn't record the beginning of the session. And I think we've gone through everything in that book. If you find anything that you think, I know Steve was flipping through like, oh, I'm going to steal some of these slides that isn't right, doesn't make sense, is spelled wrong. That's a big one. I was an English major briefly. Please let me know. I should be on, I think we have some communication that went out to you. I will make sure you have my email. I do have some cards up here that have my email. It's, barb.richards@energyiq.info. Pretty easy to find me. And I'm on the services team, so anytime you send tickets in, I get copied on all the tickets that come in as well. So I see what's going on out there. So.